Continuation of the Tuesday Night Club. The Thumb Mark of St. Peter. "And now, Aunt Jane, it is up to you," said Raymond West. "Yes, Aunt Jane, we are expecting something really spicy," chimed in Joyce Lampier. "Now you are laughing at me, dear," said Miss Marple placidly. "You think that because I have lived in this out-of-the-way spot all my life, I'm not likely to have had any more interesting experiences. God forbid that I should ever regard village life as peaceful and uneventful," said Raymond with fervor. "Not after the revelations we have heard from you. The cosmopolitan world seems a mild and peaceful place compared with St. Mary Mead." "Well, my dear," said Miss Marple, "human nature is much the same everywhere, and of course one has opportunities of observing this at closer quarters than a village." "You really are unique, Aunt Jane," cried Joyce. "I hope you don't mind me calling you Aunt Jane," she added. "I don't know why I do it." "Don't you, my dear?" said Miss Marple. She looked up for a moment or two with some quizzical in her glance, which made the blood flame in the girl's cheeks. Raymond West fidgeted and cleared his throat in a somewhat embarrassed manner. Miss Marple looked at them both and smiled again, and bent her attention once more to her knitting. "It is true, of course, that I have lived what is called a very uneventful life, but I have had a lot of experiences in solving different little problems that have arisen. Some of them have been really quite ingenious. But it would be no good telling them to you, because they are about such unimportant things that you would not be interested. Just things like who cut the meshes of Mrs. Jones's string bag, and why Mrs. Sims only wore her new fur coat once. Very interesting things, really, to any student of human nature. No, the only experience that I can remember that would be of interest to you is the one about my poor niece Mabel's husband. It is about 10 or 15 years ago now. Happily, it is all over and done with, and everyone has forgotten about it. People's memories are very short. A lucky thing, I always think." Miss Marple paused and murmured to herself, "I must just count this row. The decreasing is a little awkward. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 3 purl. That's right. Now, what was I saying? Oh, yes, about poor Mabel. Mabel was my niece. A nice girl, really a very nice girl, but just a trifle what one might call silly, rather fond of being melodramatic and saying a great deal more than she meant whenever she was upset. She married a Mr. Denman when she was 22, and I'm afraid it was not a very happy marriage. I had hoped very much that the attachment would not come to anything, for Mr. Denman was a man of very violent temper, and not the kind of man who would be patient with Mabel's foibles. And I also learned that there was insanity in his family. However, girls were just as obstinate then as they are now, and as they always will be. And Mabel married him. I didn't see very much of her after her marriage. She came to stay with me once or twice, and they asked me there several times, but as a matter of fact, I'm not very fond of staying in other people's houses, and I always managed to make some excuse. They had been married 10 years when Mr. Denman died suddenly. There were no children, and he left all his money to Mabel. I wrote, of course, and offered to come to Mabel if she wanted me, but she wrote back a very sensible letter, and I gathered that she was not altogether overwhelmed by grief. I thought that was only natural, because I knew they had not been getting on together for some time. It was not until about 3 months afterwards that I got a most hysterical letter from Mabel, begging me to come to her, and saying that things were going from bad to worse, and she couldn't stand it much longer. So, of course, continued Miss Marple, I put Clara on board wages, and sent the plate and the King Charles tankard to the bank, and I went off at once. I found Mabel in a very nervous state. The house, Myrtle Den, was a fairly large, very comfortably furnished. There was a cook and a house parlour-maid, as well as a nurse attendant to look after old Mr. Denman, Mabel's husband's father, who was what is called not quite right in the head. Quite peaceful and well-behaved, but distinctly odd at times. As I say, there was insanity in the family. I was really shocked to see the change in Mabel. She was a mess of nerves, twitching all over, yet I had the greatest difficulty in making her tell me what the trouble was. I got at it, as one always does get at these things, indirectly. I asked her about some friends of hers she was always mentioning in her letters, the Gallaghers. She said, to my surprise, that she hardly ever saw them nowadays. Other friends whom I mentioned elicited the same remark. I spoke to her then of a folly of shutting herself up and brooding, and especially of the silliness of cutting herself adrift from her friends. And then she came bursting out with the truth. It is not my doing, it is theirs. There is not a soul in this place who will speak to me now. When I go down the high street, they all get out of the way, so that they shan't have to meet me or speak to me. I'm like a kind of leper. It's awful, and I can't bear it any longer. I shall have to sell the house and go abroad. Yet why should I be driven away from my home like this? I've done nothing. I was more disturbed than I can tell you. I was knitting a comforter for Mrs. Hay at the time, and I dropped 2 stitches and never discovered it until long after. "My dear Mabel," I said, "you amaze me. But what is the cause of all this?" Even as a child, Mabel was always difficult. I had the greatest difficulty in getting her to give me a straightforward answer on my question. She would only say vague things about wicked talk and idle people who had nothing better to do than gossip, and people who put ideas into other people's heads. "That is all quite clear to me," I said. "There is evidently some story being circulated about you. But what that story is you must know as well as anyone, and you are going to tell me." "It's so wicked," moaned Mabel. "Of course it's wicked," I said briskly. "There's nothing that you can tell me about people's minds that would astonish or surprise me. Now, Mabel, will you tell me in plain English what people are saying about you?" Then it all came out. It seemed that Geoffrey Denham's death, being quite sudden and unexpected, gave rise to various rumors. In fact, and in plain English, as I had put it to her, people were saying that she had poisoned her husband. Now I expect you know there is nothing more cruel than talk, and there is nothing more difficult to combat. When people say things behind your back, there is nothing you can refute or deny. And the rumors got on growing and growing, and no one could stop. I was quite certain of one thing. Mabel was quite incapable of poisoning anyone. I didn't see why life should be ruined for her and her home, made unbearable just because, in all probability, she had been doing something silly and foolish. "There is no smoke without fire," I said. "Now, Mabel, you've got to tell me what started people off on this track. There must have been something." Mabel was very incoherent and declared that there was nothing at all, except, of course, that Geoffrey's death had been very sudden. He had seemed quite well at supper that evening, and had taken violently ill in the night. The doctor had been sent for, but the poor man had died in a few minutes after the doctor's arrival. Death had been thought to be the result of eating poisoned mushrooms. "Well," I said, "I suppose a sudden death of that kind might start tongues wagging, but surely not without some additional facts. Did you have a quarrel with Geoffrey, or anything of that kind?" She admitted that she had had a quarrel with him on the preceding morning at breakfast time. "And the servants heard it, I suppose?" I asked. They weren't in the room. No, my dear, I said, but they probably were fairly near the door outside. I knew the carrying power of Mabel's high-pitched, hysterical voice only too well. Geoffrey Denman, too, was a man given to raising his voice loudly when angry. "What did you quarrel about?" I asked. "Oh, the usual thing. It was always the same thing, over and over again. Some little thing would start us off, and then Geoffrey became impossible, and said abominable things, and I told him what I thought of him." "There had been a lot of quarreling then?" I asked. "It wasn't my fault, my dear child," I said. "It doesn't matter whose fault it was. That is not what we are discussing. In a place like this, everybody's private affairs are more or less public property. You and your husband were always quarreling. You had a particularly bad quarrel one morning, and that night your husband died suddenly and mysteriously. Is that all, or is there anything else?" "I don't know what you mean by anything else," said Mabel sullenly. "Just what I say, my dear. If you have done anything silly, don't, for heaven's sake, keep it back now. I only want to do what I can to help you." "Nothing and nobody can help me," said Mabel wildly, "except death." "Have a little more faith in Providence, dear," I said. "Now then, Mabel, I know perfectly well there is something else that you are keeping back." I always did know, even when she was a child, when she was not telling me the whole truth. It took a long time, but I got it out at last. She had gone down to the chemist that morning and had bought some arsenic. She had, of course, to sign the book for it. Naturally, the chemist had talked. "Who is your doctor?" I asked. "Dr. Rawlinson." I knew him by sight. Mabel had pointed him out to me the other day. To put it in perfectly plain language, he was what I would describe as an old dodderer. I have had too much experience of life to believe in the infallibility of doctors. Some of them are clever men, and some of them are not. Half the time the best of them don't know what it is the matter with you, and I have no truck with doctors and their medicines myself. I thought things over, and then I put my bonnet on and went to call on Dr. Rawlinson. He was just what I had thought of him, a nice old man, kindly vague, and too short-sighted as to be pitiful, slightly deaf, and, withal, touchy and sensitive to the last degree. He was on his high horse at once when I mentioned Geoffrey Denman's death. Talked for a long time about various kinds of fungi, edible and otherwise. He had questioned the cook, and she had admitted one or two of the mushrooms cooked had been a little odd, but as the shop had sent them, she thought they must be all right. The more she thought about them since, the more she was convinced that their appearance was unusual. "She would be," I said. "They would start by being quite like mushrooms in appearance, and they would end up being orange with purple spots." I gathered that Denman had been past speech when the doctor got to him. He was incapable of swallowing and had died within a few minutes. The doctor seemed perfectly satisfied with the certificate he had given, but how much of that was obstinacy and how much of it was genuine belief, I could not be sure. I went straight home and asked Mabel quite frankly why she had bought arsenic. "You must have had some idea in your mind," I pointed out. Mabel burst into tears. "I wanted to make away with myself," she moaned. "I was too unhappy. I thought I would end it all." "Have you the arsenic still?" I asked. "No, I threw it away." I sat there turning things over and over in my mind. What happened when he was taken ill? Did he call you? "No," she shook her head. "He rang the bell violently. He must have rung several times. At last Dorothy, the house parlor maid, heard it, and she waked the cook up, and they came down. When Dorothy saw him, she was frightened. He was rambling and delirious. She left the cook with him and came rushing to me. I got up and went to him. Of course, I saw at once he was dreadfully ill. Unfortunately, Brewster, who looks after old Mr. Denman, was away for the night, so there was no one who knew what to do. I sent Dorothy off for the doctor, and cook and I stayed with him. But after a few minutes, I couldn't bear it any longer, and it was too dreadful. I ran away back to my room and locked the door. Very selfish and unkind of you, I said, and no doubt that conduct of yours has done nothing to help you since. You may be sure of that. Cook will have repeated it everywhere. Well, well, this is a bad business. Next I spoke to the servants. The cook wanted to tell me about the mushrooms, but I stopped her. I was tired of these mushrooms. Instead, I questioned both of them very closely about their master's condition on that night. They both agreed that he seemed to be in great agony, that he was unable to swallow, and he could only speak in a strange voice, and when he did speak it was only rambling, nothing sensible. What did he say when he was rambling? I asked curiously. Something about some fish, wasn't it? She turned to the other. Dorothy agreed. A heap of fish, she said. Some nonsense like that. I could see at once he wasn't in his right mind, poor gentleman. There didn't seem to be any sense to be made out of that. As a last recourse, I went up to see the nurse attendant, Brewster, who was a gaunt, middle-aged woman of about 50. It is a pity that I wasn't there that night, she said. Nobody seems to have tried to do anything for him until the doctor came. I suppose he was delirious, I said doubtfully. But that is not a symptom of ptomaine poisoning, is it? It depends, said Brewster. I asked her how her patient was getting on. She shook her head. He's pretty bad, she said. Weak? Oh, no, he's strong enough physically. All but his eyesight. That is failing badly. He may outlive all of us, but his mind is failing very fast now. I had already told both Mr. and Mrs. Denman that he ought to be in an institution, but Mrs. Denman wouldn't hear of it at any price. I will say for Mabel that she always had a kind heart. Well, there's the thing as it was. I thought it over in every aspect, and at last I decided there was only one thing to be done. In view of rumors that were going about, permission must be applied for an exhume the body. A proper post-mortem must be made, and lying tongues quieted once and for all. Mabel, of course, made a fuss, mostly on sentimental grounds, disturbing the dead man in his peaceful grave, etc., etc. But I was firm. I won't make a long story of this part of it. We got the order and they did the autopsy, or whatever they call it. But the result was not so satisfactory as it might have been. There was no trace of arsenic, and that was all to the good. But the actual words of the report were that there was nothing to show by what means deceased had come to his death. So you see, that didn't lead us out of the trouble altogether. People went on talking about rare poisons, impossible to detect, and rubbish of that sort. I had seen the pathologist who had done the post-mortem. I had asked him several questions, though he tried his best to get out of answering most of them. But I got out of him that he considered it highly unlikely that the poisoned mushrooms were the cause of the death. An idea was simmering in my mind, and I asked him what poison, if any, could have been employed to obtain that result. He made a long explanation to me, most of which I must admit I did not follow. But it amounted to this. The death might have been due to some strong vegetable alkali. The idea I had was this. Supposing the taint of insanity was in Geoffrey Denman's blood also, might he not have made away with himself? He had, at one period of his life, studied medicine, and he would have a good knowledge of poisons and their effects. I didn't think it sounded very likely, but it was the only thing I could think of, and I was nearly at my wits' end, I can tell you. Now, I dare say you modern young people will laugh, but when I am in a really bad trouble, I always say a little prayer to myself. Anywhere when I am walking along the street or at a bazaar, and I always get an answer. It may be some trifling thing, apparently quite unconnected with the subject, but there it is. And I had that text pinned over my bed when I was a little girl. Ask and you shall receive. On the morning that I am telling you about, I was walking along the high street, and I was praying hard. I shut my eyes, and when I opened them, what do you think was the first thing that I saw? 5 faces with varying degrees of interest were turned to Miss Marple. It may be safely assumed, however, that no one would have guessed the answer to the question right. I saw, said Miss Marple impressively, the window of the fishmonger's shop. There was only one thing in it, a fresh haddock. She looked round triumphantly. "Oh, my blank," said Raymond West. "An answer to prayer, a fresh haddock." "Yes, Raymond," said Miss Marple severely, "and there is no need to be profane about it. The hand of God is everywhere. The first thing I saw were the black spots, the marks of St. Peter's thumb, and that is the legend, you know. St. Peter's thumb, and that brought the thing home to me. I needed faith, the ever-true faith of St. Peter. I connected the two things together, faith and fish." Sir Henry blew his nose rather hurriedly. Joyce bit her lip. Now, what did that bring to my mind? Of course, both the cook and the house parlour-maid mentioned fish as being one of the things spoken by the dying man. I was convinced, absolutely convinced, that there was some solution of the mystery to be found in these words. I went home determined to get to the bottom of the matter. She paused. "Has it ever occurred to you," the old lady went on, "how much we go by what is called, I believe, the context? There is a place on Dartmoor called Grey Withers. If you were talking to a farmer there and mentioned Grey Withers, he would probably conclude that you were speaking of these stone circles. Yet it is possible that you might be speaking of the atmosphere in the same way. If you were meaning the stone circles, an outsider hearing a fragment of the conversation might think you meant the weather. So when we repeat a conversation, we don't, as a rule, repeat the actual words. We put in some other words that seem to us to mean exactly the same thing. I saw both the cook and Dorothy separately. I asked the cook if she was quite sure that her master had really mentioned a heap of fish. She said she was quite sure. "Were these his exact words?" I asked, "or did he mention some particular kind of fish?" "That's it," said the cook. "It was some particular kind of fish, but I can't remember what now. A heap of— Now, what was it? Not any of the fish you send to table. Would it be a perch now? Or pike? No, it didn't begin with a P." Dorothy also recalled that her master had mentioned some kind of fish. Some outlandish kind of fish it was, she said. A pile of— Now, what was it? "Did he say heap or pile?" I asked. "I think he said pile, but there, I really can't be sure. It's so hard to remember the actual words, especially when they don't seem to make sense. But now I come to think of it, I'm pretty sure that it was pile, and that the fish began with a C, but it wasn't cod or crayfish." "The next part is where I am really proud of myself," said Miss Marple, "because, of course, I don't know anything about drugs. Nasty, dangerous things, I call them. I have got an old recipe of my grandmother's for tansy tea that is worth any amount of your drugs. But I knew that there were several medical volumes in the house, and in one of them there was an index of drugs. You see, my idea was that Geoffrey had taken some particular poison and was trying to say the name of it. Well, I looked down to the list of H's, beginning H-E. Nothing there sounded likely. Then I began on the P's, and almost at once I came to, what do you think? She looked round, postponing her moment of triumph. Pilocarpine. Can't you imagine a man who could hardly speak trying to drag that word out? What would that sound like to a cook who had never heard the word? Wouldn't it convey the impression of pile of carp? By Jove, said Sir Henry. I should never have hit upon that, said Dr. Pender. Most interesting, said Dr. Petherick. Really most interesting. I turned quickly to the page indicated in the index. I read about pilocarpine and its effects on the eye and other things that didn't seem to have any bearing on the case, but at last I came to a most significant phrase. Has been tried with success as an antidote to atropine poisoning. I can't tell you the light that dawned upon me then. I never had thought it likely that Geoffrey Denman would take his life. No, this new solution was not only possible, but I was absolutely sure it was correct one, because all the pieces fitted in logically. I'm not going to try to guess, said Raymond. Go on, Aunt Jane. Tell us what was so startlingly clear to you. I don't know anything about medicine, of course, said Miss Marple, but I did happen to know this, that when my eyesight was failing, the doctor ordered me drops with atropine sulfate in them. I went through upstairs to old Mr. Denman's room. I didn't beat about the bush. Mr. Denman, I said, I know everything. Why did you poison your son? He looked at me for a minute or two, rather handsome old man he was, in his way, and then he burst out laughing. It was one of the most vicious laughs I have ever heard. I can assure you it made my flesh creep. I had only heard anything like it once before, when poor Mrs. Jones went off her head. Yes, he said, I got even with Geoffrey. I was too clever for Geoffrey. He was going to put me away, he was, have me shut up in an asylum. I heard them talking about it. Mabel is a good girl. Mabel struck up for me, but I knew she wouldn't be able to stand up against Geoffrey. In the end, he would have his own way. He always did. But I settled him. I settled my kind, loving son. Ha 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 ha. I crept down in the night. It was quite easy. Brewster was away. My dear son was asleep. He had a glass of water by the side of his bed. He always woke up in the middle of the night and drank it off. I poured it away. Ha 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 ha. And I emptied the bottle of eye drops into the glass. He would wake up and swill it down before he knew what it was. There was only a tablespoon of it. Quite enough, quite enough. And so he did. They came to me in the morning and broke it to me very gently. They were afraid it would upset me. Ha 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 ha. Well, said Miss Marple, this is the end of the story. Of course the old man was put in an asylum. He wasn't really responsible for what he had done. The truth was known, and everybody was sorry for Mabel, and could not do enough to make it up to her for the unjust suspicions they had had. But if it hadn't been for Geoffrey realizing what the stuff was he had swallowed and trying to get everybody to get hold of the antidote without delay, it might never have been found out. I believe there are very definite symptoms with atropine, dilated pupils of the eyes, and all that. But of course, as I have said, Dr. Rawlinson was very short-sighted, poor old man, and in the same medical book which I went on reading, and some of it was most interesting. It gave the symptoms of ptomaine poisoning and atropine, and they are not unlike. But I can assure you I have never seen a pile of fresh haddock without thinking of the thumb mark of St. Peter. There was a very long pause. "My dear friend," said Mr. Pretherick, "my very dear friend, you really are amazing." "I shall recommend Scotland Yard to come to you for advice," said Sir Henry. "Well, at all events, Aunt Jane," said Raymond, "there's one thing that you don't know." "Oh, yes, I do, dear," said Miss Marple. "It happened just before dinner, didn't it? When you took Joyce out to admire the sunset. It is a very favorite place, that. There by the jasmine hedge. That's where the milkman asked Annie if he could put up the banns." "Dash it all, Aunt Jane," said Raymond, "don't spoil all the romance. Joyce and I aren't like the milkman and Annie." "That is where you make a mistake, dear," said Miss Marple. "Everybody is very much alike, really. But fortunately, perhaps, they don't realize it." And we will continue this story next Wednesday. Thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.